Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Inside the Birds Fantasy Football Show with Andrew DiCecco. I'm Jeff Mosher, and of course, I'm joined as always by InsideTheBirds.com's Andrew DiCecco, our resident fantasy football expert. I want to do something different for this show, Andrew, because we've reached a stage in the fantasy football season where you're either gearing up for a playoff push and hoping to, show your best team, or you're out of it and you're trying to think about next year. A lot of owners are in dynasty or keeper leagues, and they may be looking to maneuver and try to make their team better for next year by trading a keeper that they might have now and trying to stockpile young talent. I know a lot of I personally do that when my team is out of it. Fortunately, I'm not in that situation this year. But I want to ask you about a couple of players that if you were somebody who was trying to keep an eye on the next great keeper, you would try to get while you could this year. So let's start with running backs. This has been an interesting year for running backs, especially young ones. Are there any that you would keep your eye on to try to acquire on the cheap for the years going forward?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, Jeff. A couple guys that I would look at the running back position would be DeAndre Swift from the Detroit Lions, Javonte Williams, who I've been very high on. I think he's going to pick up some steam later in the season here. He's someone that I would try and get if you can. A.J. Dillon with the Green Bay Packers. Aaron Jones is obviously getting up there in age, and he struggles with some injuries. So A.J. Dillon's going to be a factor. Obviously, the cold weather there in Green Bay, his physical, tough, downhill running style really favors well to what they're looking to do and establish there. So those are three running backs in particular that I would look to secure if you have the opportunity.
Any bounce back candidates, guys who didn't have good years at the running back position this year, but are young and that you're looking to for next year?
Antonio Gibson.
Yeah,
Antonio Gibson's one of my favorite running backs in football. Obviously, even last week when he had a big game, he only averaged 2.6 yards a carry. The offensive line's not great, but you have to believe in the skill set of the player. And he has an explosive skill set that translates very favorably to the current landscape of the NFL. And you have to trust and believe in that. I think he will bounce back next year. I think this year is more of an outlier.
Makes sense to me. Let's take a look at wide receivers. Anybody that comes to mind that you would want to have on your team as a potential keeper for next year?
Jaylen Waddle immediately comes to mind as someone who I think can transition into a Tyreek Hill-esque role with a more consistent quarterback. And that's expected to change next season. We don't know what that dynamic's going to look like, but I think he's going to have a more consistent passer for facilitating the ball to him. And I like his ability to affect all three levels of the field, and especially his explosiveness that it can win you any week. So I think that he's someone that you can lean on and look to. Also, Elijah Moore with the Jets. I really liked him coming out. I thought he was a very polished product. He's someone that can really be effective for you in PPR. But I think that as the Jets move forward with Zach Wilson, I think you're going to see that chemistry sort of blossom, and another player with electric open field ability that can give you a home run play at any given time.
Yeah, Andrew, with wide receivers especially, a change in quarterback could make a huge difference. And so there are a couple of guys I wanted to ask you about, knowing that their team might be on a different quarterback next year, that you might just want to keep on your team to give yourself the option this offseason of having them on your roster. So they might be a potential keeper. Two guys that come to mind: Chase Claypool of the Steelers, and of course, Cortland Sutton of the Broncos. Do you like their potential as keepers if there's a different quarterback in place for these teams, for wherever they are?
Yeah, that's a great one. I like both players a lot, particularly Chase Claypool. I think that he has a lot more to offer than what he's showing right now in that limited offense. I mean, the Steelers on paper have one of the best offensive skill sets in skill players in football, with Najee Harris and those three receivers that they have. Unfortunately, their quarterback, they're sort of hamstringed by their quarterback play. And I think Chase Claypool is going to emerge next season as a red zone option, but not only that, but as like I said, with Jaylen Waddle, I think he's going to affect all three levels of the field. And I think he's going to become the top receiver in that offense.
Yeah.
And who was the other one that you mentioned? You mentioned Chase
Cortland Sutton.
Cortland Sutton. Cortland Sutton's another one that I thought was going to have a much bigger season than he had, especially in the touchdown department. Obviously, Teddy Bridgewater is a more conservative quarterback that doesn't necessarily push the ball down the field. So I don't think he's able to accentuate his skill set. So those are two players that I would absolutely hold if you have them.
All right. And last, any quarterbacks that you think, and I'm not a big fan of keeping quarterbacks unless it's like a Patrick Mahomes or maybe Lamar Jackson. I don't typically do it. Some people do, but are any quarterbacks there that you think will really come into their own next year?
I mean, if I'm with you, I don't like the whole quarterbacks, but if I had to pick a couple, I would say Justin Fields and probably Mac Jones as guys that I think will take the next step. I'm not including Jalen Hurts in that because I think that from a fantasy perspective, he's already in the upper echelon. So when you look at someone like a Mac Jones who doesn't necessarily, he puts up the wins and things like that. He doesn't have these gaudy stats. I do think that next season, when he becomes more familiar and comfortable with the NFL game and his personnel improves, they don't have a ton of options at wide receiver that he's throwing to Kendrick Bourne and Jacoby Myers. I think that he's going to take a next step. And I think Justin Fields, you're starting to see a player who's improving every week. And I think his arrow is pointing up.
Yeah, I could see Justin Fields as that kind of guy. Not sure yet on Trey Lance because we just haven't seen him play enough.
Yeah.
But in that offense, I can understand people being tantalized. But again, a little too rich for keeper material. All right, let's move on and talk about your waiver claims for this week 11 action in the NFL. Who have you got your eyes on?
Yeah, so this is a really important week for teams looking to make that late season playoff push. And I have some players to pick up in almost every position. So looking at quarterback, Cam Newton. And Cam Newton did not start last week, but he came in and invigorated that offense. He is a dual threat player, and we've seen what he can do when he's playing at a top tier level. I think he's a low end starter. And I think if you're in a pinch, you could do a lot worse than Cam Newton. So if he's out there and you need a quarterback, if you're facing a bye week dilemma, you can play him, and he has a relatively safe floor. And I also would look at, we mentioned Justin Fields. Justin Fields, the arrow is pointing up on him. I picked him up last week on his bye because he sort of was flying under the radar. And I see him as someone that's really going to sort of elevate his performance late in the season here. And I want to, kind of get on that train early before it became too late. And he's got the Ravens this week. So we've seen the Ravens really struggle, especially out of the last 5 weeks. I believe they've surrendered a ton of points to quarterbacks at least 3 of those weeks. So I like Justin Fields this week as a plug and play option.
Justin then Fields, when you look at still available in over 70% of Yahoo leagues. Very interesting.
Yeah. So now transitioning over to running backs, Jeff, I would look at Ramondre Stevenson, the running back for the Patriots. Obviously, they have Damian Harris. He's there, but and Bill Belichick has been volatile in his deployment of his running backs. However, it's hard to ignore 114 yards and 2 touchdowns, which he ran against the Cleveland Browns last week. He's going to be a red zone option at the least, and I think that as a flex option, he would be an ideal plug and play this week. Also, we mentioned Adrian Peterson. We mentioned Jerry McNichols on this show. I think, oddly enough, it looks like Deontay Foreman is emerging and ever so slightly. I don't want to make it seem like he's running away with the backfield. I think he's sort of emerging as the top guy there. He catches the football. He had 48 yards receiving. I think he took 31% of the snaps last week, which led the group. So he's someone that I actually added him this week, as a speculative ad, especially knowing that they have a lot to play for here coming down the stretch. And wide receiver, how about former Eagles wide receiver Marcus Johnson? 5 receptions, 100 yards on 6 targets last week. Julio Jones is going to be out of the picture for the immediate future. The Titans really liked him. Obviously, Marcus has had a really good training camp everywhere he's gone, and he got hurt at the end of the summer, and they held him on their they held him out, but they had a role for him. He was, even though Nick Westbrook's there, even though Chester Rogers is there, they plugged him in. And obviously he has a good continuity there with Ryan Tannehill. So I think that's going to continue, and he should benefit from AJ Brown getting extra looks. So he's someone that I would look to there.
Yeah. And that offense has been rolling for a couple of weeks now, even without Derrick Henry. All right, let's get into some matchups that you like, some players that you should start this week because of a favorable matchup.
I like Leonard Fournette going against the Giants this week. Obviously, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are coming off a demoralizing loss to the Washington football team. You know what that means. You know that Tom Brady and the offense is going to look to pour it on. So they're going to beat them through the air. They're going to beat them on the ground, and they're going to run the score up. I think that they're going to be able to establish a dominance with Leonard Fournette. at the point of attack there. And I think that they're going to run him early and often. I like him in that matchup. I like AJ Dillon going against the Vikings. 64 yards, 2 touchdowns last week. We talked about his physicality and the physical element that he brings to their offense that Aaron Jones does not. I like him this week. I would play him. Jaylen Waddle is another player that we talked about. I think Jaylen Waddle, he's had 28 targets the past 3 weeks. And I think now that there's a little bit more stability there at the quarterback position, it's not Jacoby Brissett, you're going to see him sort of flourish there. And how can I forget Mark Ingram? Mark Ingram going against the Philadelphia Eagles this week. Didn't have a eye-popping output last week, but he did find the end zone, and he is going against a very porous, I should say, a vulnerable Eagles run defense. Even though they've made some alterations and to try and patch up that area of their deficiency, I still think his downhill running style really attacks the Eagles where they're most vulnerable. So he's a player that I would look to plug in if you can.
All right, give me some players you would sit this week.
Jordan Howard. I mean,
Wow.
As funny as it sounds, 211 yards over in his 3 games. Miles Sanders is coming back. I think Miles Sanders will be the top running back. You heard Nick Sirianni yesterday say he's our starter when he's back. That's not going to change. He's the most gifted running back on the roster. Jordan Howard will have a role, Jeff, obviously, but I think it's going to be very limited, and it's going to cater to his skill set, which is going to be short yardage and red zone. So I would sort of trend away from him this week, and at least until you see how the backfield shapes up. Antonio Gibson, we talked about him averaging 2.6 yards a carry last week, despite finding the end zone twice. I don't like him this week against a very tough Carolina front. If you have another option, I would tend to go in that direction. And Marvin Jones, a wide receiver from the Jacksonville Jaguars, he is their de facto number 1, but he has not eclipsed anything more than 35 yards receiving since week 6. So, I mean, if you're looking to, I would get away from that entire passing attack unless you're looking at a guy like a Jamal Agnew, who is sort of taking on that Laviska Shenault role. So I would try to avoid that whole aerial attack for the Jaguars if I could.
Avoid the Jags like the plague. I definitely agree with you on that one. All right, great stuff. That is Andrew DiCecco from InsideTheBirds.com, and of course, a great 80s hairband connoisseur, as you see in the background. We'll do it again next week. Thanks for watching the Inside the Birds Fantasy Football Show.